So yeah, thank you. I'm Greg, as Steven mentioned. Thank you, organizers, Flexi and Volatility, for a great conference. It's a bunch of tough acts to follow, especially with how knowledgeable Jimmy was. So I will do my best to make up for lack of deep technical knowledge with hopefully some fun, and maybe we can get a little bit rowdy with it. As Steven mentioned, I work on the counter espionage team at Proofpoint, but I am not going to take our subject matter super seriously today. Even though it is a serious subject. So the company I work at, Proofpoint, there's a few of us here in the crowd that you'll hear hooting, hollering every now and again. We're primarily an email provider, so that is sort of the lens of how we're going to look at our subject today. And our subject is the GRU, hence the title. And it says here in my notes that you guys were supposed to start booing when I changed that slide over. So if we want to go back, we can try it again. The GRU, boo. Or since it's almost Halloween, the GR, boo. Oh, yes, I got to laugh. I was going to walk off if that joke didn't hit. Of course, we're talking about Russian military intelligence, an organization that collectively has been really busy since Russia decided to just be the worst and invade Ukraine. I know that we've sort of danced around that topic, but I will firmly state my flag and say we don't like that. We want them out of there. So I'm sure a lot of you have read the great reporting coming out of like CERT UA, IBM, Google Tag, Mandiant, ESET, Dragos, all these other companies about countering GRU operations in Ukraine. Today we're going to flip that on its head a little bit and talk about continued operations outside of Ukraine, highlighting what I'm hoping to show is just how large and effective these teams can be and work on multiple fronts and collection efforts at the same time. And so these are the main GRU aligned clusters that we track. We use the TA numbering convention, as boring as that is. It makes things a little bit less spicy when we name our actors. The irony behind this is that the TA471 cluster, Cadet Blizzard, that NSA and CISA just came out with an advisory on about a month ago that basically said these guys are total noobs and clowned them for being effectively like new recruits and new cadets. They've been the only one of these groups that have withered away in our data as the conflict has gone on, and the rest of them have actually sort of surged, particularly in the last year. So that's really what we're going to explore. Before we get into the actors themselves, I wanted to touch on our attribution methodology, which is an excuse to just show this lovely graphic that someone on our marketing team made. And it includes many common elements that everybody else in the room uses for attribution. But there are also some specifics that we see being an email provider across a pretty wide set of customers that we find particularly useful, such as who the targets are, the number of emails that we see per campaign, upstream sending infrastructure, volume of messages, or the targets themselves. And so those are the things that we're naturally going to sort of emphasize today. So our first cluster today, and I don't want to linger too long on that, is Unk Cosmo Patron. You might know them as overlapping with Sandworm. And if you were in Jimmy's presentation before, you just saw all the crap that they're doing in Ukraine that is just bad. All the wipers, all the disruptive stuff. That's a lot coming out of this group. Before anyone says, oh, why don't they have a TA number? Why don't you just call them Sandworm? We have a standard of how things get promoted in our data that a few people here have helped write, and they haven't hit the sufficient number of clusterable and different sets of phishing campaigns to get TA designation. So that's why they are an UNC group. So you know them from being the worst doing electrical stuff. What we're going to talk about is their phishing campaigns outside of Ukraine. So we'll explore a couple of those here. This first one we observed in December 2023, which kick-started an LNK to PowerShell-based infection chain, and it targeted entities in the think tank, defense, and aerospace industries. We saw a few variants of this, one spoofing NASA, and offering a job to that entity, which sounds pretty cool, and one that was a little bit more boring and human rightsy and saying, oh, here's a report from USAID about how many people are like suffering worldwide, which was a little bit less fun. But both sets of users are encouraged to click a link, which will download a zip file. And of course, it is just a zip file containing what looks like a PDF, but is actually an LNK file. If the user executes that LNK file thinking it's a PDF, the LNK will parse itself and look for a base64 encoded blob sort of stuck at the end of its frame, save that content to a JPEG file on disk, decode it, and then run it. And it decodes to a really straightforward and nicely linted PowerShell script All the LNKs across the campaign that we saw all shared that nice machine identifier, which made it pretty easy to sort of pivot on. That was one of the things, weird artifacts, Steven, that I was referencing. But so the drop PowerShell script is a tool called HTTP shell, I believe, from GitHub. And all this script will do is reparse the LNK file, looking for base64 encoded PDF, display it to the user, and then gather victim credentials and send them off to a C2 server, pdf-online.top, which one of our previous speakers, Tom Hagel, kindly pointed out. The PowerShell script can also upload files to the C2 as well as download and execute files. Interestingly, while Tom observed, referenced this mention of Sliver in his tweet, we didn't see that, but we saw something else come back in this weird HTTP response that actually looks fairly straightforward, but it goes through a little bit of decoding by the PowerShell payload, where it'll get reversed. A couple of bytes or characters will get swapped for other ones, and then on base64, revealing a payload that was like 200 lines of PowerShell all to launch a scheduled task, which is sort of a theme for this group of a lot of lines of code to do very, very little. And this will sort of be a running theme with a lot of these groups, is that it will sort of reduplicate work that a previous component already did. And so it will find the drop JPEG, parse it again, looking for the base64 blob, decode it, and then run it again. So it's simple persistence, just rerunning effectively the PowerShell script. And at the time, these lures got a lot of attention on social media. What didn't make as much noise was the follow-up campaign from January of this year, which was actually a really big tactic shift from our perspective. This says internal Russia campaign. What this really is Russian journalists and dissidents that are no longer in Russia but are, in the West somewhere, and I'll sort of leave it at that. So in the instance we have on screen, it is a Gmail account impersonating a Russian dissident journalist named Sofia Prezniakova. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. Here reaching out to a different Russian journalist, accusing them of plagiarism in the article you see there. The targeted journalist points out that they, in fact, did not write the article that they were being accused of plagiarizing, and not to be beaten, the actor then said, no, I saved it on my OneDrive account, and it clearly shows that you authored it, which is a very normal thing to do, is to archive things on your personal OneDrive account. If they click the OneDrive link, they are sent a RAR file, which contains an LNK, and you can sort of follow where this is going. Effectively rewrapping the LNK file that they had previously used. The same command is now just appended to the end of the file, and the new LNK command line will parse it again, look for that command, execute that command, which will then reparse the LNK file, and the series continues, eventually dropping the same PowerShell script we saw before, but with a new C2 API gate.xyz. So looking at this group from sort of 10,000 feet, what was most interesting about it from our perspective is that the dissonant activity only tied in nicely with sort of the spraying because of the payloads. We typically don't see that on the espionage side. We will typically see a shift in, oh, okay, well, this payload didn't work, let's try another version of it, or we'll update it, do something like that. Most other clusters would swap those easier components out rather than completely changing email TTPs, with going from something like building HTML lure content sent to a bunch of people versus sort of hands-on operator having to social engineer someone. They're not completely foreign skill sets, but they are different enough that it was a little bit surprising to see these two sort of angles of this activity. And so from that, I think it just sort of highlights the number of people they may have, or just how flexible they are, which is a pain. We haven't seen them since then. We have some suspected activity, but not enough to firmly tie it to them. When they get, just like Mandiant, when they get promoted, we will have a big party, release a big paper. Everyone will be dancing in the street about it. So up next, the next group we'll talk about is TA426, which overlaps with Zebracy and UAC0063. This is an actor we actually see exclusively on Fridays, sending lure documents via compromised accounts. The lure documents themselves typically use spoofed content relevant to people involved in Central Asian politics, spoofing things like the Red Crescent Humanitarian Aid Group, or spoofing Kazakh diplomats. Notably, many of the lure documents upon initial opening will have that sort of telltale gray box that you can see there, and will be protected and quote-unquote obfuscated if the user enables macros, which is a very normal thing to have happen in 2024. They're displayed a much cleaner version of the document. So let's get into the nesting doll that is the macros, which I thought that I made it big enough, but it still might be tough to see. The macro will unprotect the document, obviously, as we talked about earlier, making it more legible to the user. It'll then do some registry modifications to mark sort of the rest of the execution as protected based on the access VBOM. And then the macro will walk the rest of the document looking for additional macro code called C1 in the active document variables. And C1 is present in the settings.xml portion of the document. So more code to go looking for. And if we open settings.xml, we see this, which is, I don't like it. It's a whole heap of weirdness. It's long blobs, decimal and hex characters, and then what looks like some more macro code up at the top where C1 is. It's enhanced a little bit here. Effectively, these chunks of Visual Basic are helper macro functions. The first one, C1, that we don't have on the screen, is used to set up execution of the other two. The pop macro is then used to walk the rest of the values in the settings XML file, hex decode them, and then save them to disk, named record service. That's the file name, record service. And then the push function will set up a scheduled task called standalone service to execute the dropped file with MSHTA. The problem is that when you open that record service file, you get this god-awful looking HTA file. The header looks kind of normal, but I don't know what the hell is going on in that script section, and I hate it. It turns out there's a thing called VB script encoding that MSHTA can directly interpret, from what I can tell, without having the script having to decode itself first, which is just awful. Thankfully, he spoke earlier. Everyone's favorite streamer, John Hammond, ran into the same bullshit a couple years ago, and very kindly streamed about updating an old DDA Stevens tool that will decode all of this stuff and updating it to Python 3. So thankfully, there's tooling to sort of decode it, which if you do using that tool or binary refinery, you get something much more legible that is more VB script, which will continue to be a theme for the rest of this actor. This is a Visual Basic backdoor called HatVibe. Thank you to ESET for the original naming of it. And of course, it just sets up a large hex-encoded chunk to be decoded and then XORed with a victim-specific key, which in turn becomes more Visual Basic. The embedded script will basically just handles engagement with the C2. Weirdly, every request will send out the computer name and the username in the user agent string. And then in the HTTP body, there's like this junk JSON library of just garbage values that you can kind of see present in the top of the string as just hard-coded string values. I don't know why they're doing that, but they're doing it, and it's been consistent over a few campaigns that we've seen, so maybe just trying to avoid detection or something. Where the traffic actually gets more interesting is that they use markers as part of their protocol. So when that first beacon happens, if the C2 responds with data starting with that SD5DDF3 value you see there, it's highlighted down below in the PCAP as well, the malware will execute that response, of course, as more Visual Basic. And this is effectively as a secondary listener that is getting run in memory. This obviously isn't a file getting saved to disk. It's just VB script and running it again, which is sometimes a little bit hard, at least for us, to monitor those commands getting run. So intercepting the traffic has been a lot easier on our end than monitoring those commands. And effectively, this will use two more traffic markers, one looking for more Visual Basic code to get executed, basically as sort of an intermediary for not having a reverse shell, but being able to execute commands. And we've seen them execute things like who am I and sort of the normal recon wrapped inside of VBS. The other one will download data from the C2, save it to disk, and then run it. So effectively setting up a stage 3. If you got lost in the sauce on that, don't worry. This is sort of the high-level overview of what's happening. It's basically a Russian nesting doll of hex decoding and Visual Basic, which is fun the first time you look at it, and then the second time you see a wave from this group, you're like, you're still doing this? Why? There are a lot of samples of this on VT, and CertUA published about a different campaign. I think that we didn't see, and the documents are on VirusTotal if you want to go check them out. We haven't seen the next stage, basically in my tenure here at Proofpoint, which I think is like 2.5 or 3 years. But previously, we've seen variants of what Bitdefender calls DownX and what ESET calls Cherry Spy, which is a Python-based backdoor that they've used for, I think, since 2019 or so. My math might be off. It might be closer to 2021, but it's compiled in heavily obfuscated Python that somebody much smarter than me can go check out because I don't have the wherewithal to go through it. Interestingly, in the course of analytical history, TA422 and TA426 in places outside of us have treated these two as the same entity. Effectively, this is all sort of like the APT28 SOFICE style entity. And I just want to show why we think that they're a little bit different. In our view, TA426 uses custom implants like Hat Vibe and Cherry Spy and macro documents, and their goal appears to be access via infection to users engaged in Central Asian politics. And on the delivery side, they have a few much different tells than the folks in TA422 or APT28, who, hint, hint, is our next subject. They'll send 2 lures on Fridays from the same compromised account. One will typically be like a thread hijacked lure and say, oh, I have this document for you. Can you check it out? One will just sort of be like a typical cold email. But they'll send both of those to the same users on the same day from the same compromised account. So it always comes in pairs, which is just like kind of strange, but it makes finding this group a lot easier in our data. I think that really stands out compared to what we see from 422, who's have much greater interest, at least for the last 2 years, in gathering victim credentials to a much wider variety of entities. And so using those accesses for later use. And so they don't tend to use compromised accounts, but a lot of free mail providers. No macros or Word docs, but lots of third-party hosting compared to TA426, who had controlled their own infrastructure. You can see a couple of the domains there. And a lot more just broad targeting of government entities and things like that. They're probably the most published about threat cluster in the history of our space. So the 2 handsome gentlemen you see there already talked about them earlier today. If that was like their on the ground A team, the 422 we're going to talk about for the rest of the talk is more like the B or the C team. Not to say that we shouldn't underestimate them. That's going to be a takeaway later, but they're not doing what you saw Steven and Sean talk about. But I think it'll actually be helpful to talk through where we've seen them evolve through the last year. And so flashing back to this time last year, or maybe a little bit earlier in October, this was the state of TA422. Almost exclusively sending from Portugal mail, either sending the Outlook TNEF exploit or using something like Webhook or Mockbin to send links to download a family called Headlace. The Outlook TNEF exploit looked like this, together NCLM creds. Us and a gazillion other people have talked about it, so we don't need to spend any time on it. And emails like this were used to deliver a family called Hat Vibe. Sometimes these were much more politically targeted, and sometimes it's, I don't know you, and I'm not interested in international relations, person. So at its core, Headlace will launch a headless version of Microsoft Edge, gather metadata about the victim's downloads, desktop, and documents folders. It effectively will grab file names and hashes. It'll then upload that in an HTML blob to another webhook URL, which if you know how to go looking for those, you can then see who got targeted and maybe which operators infected themselves. The malware can then execute additional downloaded stages already either in sort of bat script or a .cmd format. But we ourselves haven't observed any follow-up stages, just know that the components are there. And so throughout the fall and winter of 2023, we saw TA422 continue to do this. But starting in November, we started to see more webhook URLs from Portugal Mail, which was sort of expected, but it wasn't delivering Headlace. It was a cred harvest campaign using this lure that we hadn't seen before. And it turns out this was, at least in our view, their first foray into corporate Outlook credential harvesting. We call this family Jump Hook, and the code changes fairly regularly, but it's pretty consistent in the landing page that it'll display. It will almost always send a post to a third-party listener service. In this case, this one is Webhook. Of course, I'm not showing the use of the post request here. It'll always use the same icons too. So if you catch one of these and you want to just hash the icons or carve out the base 64 and use that in a detection, you're going to have a lot of luck because the icons are actually unique to them. As time progressed, we observed this getting used over and over again, this combination of the exact lure that we just talked about, and then this landing page. And it sort of became like a steady heartbeat of their operations. And, oh, we haven't seen them in a month. Have we missed one of these campaigns? And the answer was almost always no, they just haven't sent one. And then we would inevitably get one the next day, usually when I or someone else in charge was traveling, and it made it really inconvenient. In February, we started entering what we'll sort of refer to, or as the kids would say, as TA422's experimentation arc. And this phase started when we, at least for us, when we found a hyper similar fish leading to the same looking landing page. So sort of the eyeball test. Okay, this is, probably the same stuff. But there were some key differences. The cred harvest was hosted on an actor control domain, not on webhook or Maki or something like that. And the kit itself was actually pretty different in how it handled credentials. And if we go back to the email, it actually screams "Go Fish" to us. The URLs, the @Cali message ID, the Xmailer saying it's "Go Fish" are all sort of tells that this is probably a Go Fish system. Additionally, the sender, that Xsite Systems, it sort of matches like what TA422 would use in their email, like the header from field, but not using a compromised system for sending it before. So this was a little bit odd. What that ran into that was incongruent with what we knew was that none of the webhook URLs or this fish kit was anywhere on URL scan. It wasn't on VT, at least not that we could find. And so is this just a well-informed red team spoofing TA422 and saying, okay, well, we've seen this before. It was at a customer that sees them all the time. Had they just hired a really good red team to spoof this activity again, or maybe test us? But there was another wrinkle. The server hosting the cred harvest was a compromised Ubiquiti router that had responder on port 445. Does that ring a bell for anybody in the crowd? I see one or two people nodding. Back in February, I think every government agency that exists collaborated on a release talking about APT28 or TA422's use of responder on compromised Ubiquiti routers. And so we got some stronger feelings about that being TA422. We actually got closure on this the very next day because we had a high confidence TA422 domain based on reuse of a CZ mail sender that we'd seen before, sending messages with Maki links that would download a zip that all felt very much familiar at targets that would see them regularly. But instead of the zip loading the headlace malware suite, it contained 3 shortcut files: online doc URL, shared folder.lnk, and website.website, which apparently will get treated as a shortcut to a URL. All of these, instead of being HTTP, would connect via SMB and that file handler to a remote server. That remote server was the same server hosting the Go Fish cred harvest the day before. Based on everything that we could tell in sort of like census and Shodan and stuff, that server had not changed hands. So pretty confident that it was at least the same adversary doing this day after day. And this was sort of like an intermediate shift for TA422, going back to having an interest in NTLM credentials instead of user ones. In the last 18 months, we've seen like a pretty concerted effort from them to gather NTLM creds, whether through the Outlook or WinRAR CVEs, headlace campaigns that load the PowerShell NTLM type 2 script that you can see there, and now these shortcut files. So we, in turn, made a concerted effort to go back hunting through our data and monitoring for campaigns that gather NTLM credentials. In that pursuit, we hit gold a couple of weeks later, where we found this pretty weird fish at a bunch of those same customers that would always see TA422. The embedded URL appears to link to a Europa article talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is topical and timely, but the URL actually points to an IP literal host. And it's an SMB URL with the file handler like we'd seen in those shortcut files, hoping to force end-to-end authentication. But check out the exclamation point highlighted there at the end. This is actually attempting to exploit the moniker link vulnerability to bypass the Outlook preview pane to hopefully, with no user interaction, get an NTLM credential harvest to happen without the user engaging with it at all. At that time, that IP was hosting an in-packet listener on port 445, which was even more confusing to us because one of the e-crime groups, I think TA577, was also doing this big wave of NTLM credential harvesting with in-packet, but not using moniker link. But some of the IPs sort of like crossed over in our census queries. So it was a little bit like, is this all one bucket? Are we like screwed? Like, are they working? Like the fear of like, oh my God, are they sending spam on behalf of the GRU? Is everything we know wrong? And after like 3 minutes of analysis, we were like, oh, this is just sort of coincidental and happening at the same time. What was disappointing was that this was a one-time trial and not something that we saw them do again, and which was sort of surprising given like setting up that URL to exploit something. That's not taking a lot of work, right? Like adding an exclamation point and to a at the end there isn't exactly like high effort for someone setting up an email campaign. So this effectively ended their experimentation arc in the NCLM space, and they returned to just caring about user credentials. So we continue to see webhook or the jump hook credfish campaigns get used over and over and over again until about July, where we saw an update that effectively streamlined a lot of things and made the scripts within the HTML just broken up and a little bit more elegant and easier to read. And it was a little bit more polished, but not exactly anything to write home about until the next day in July, when instead of a link, we see a lure sent from a Sputnik Media message ID from a Big Mer sender, which is a free mail provider in Russia, which is so strange that they would sort of like bastardize Russian free mail providers to send phishing emails. We're still not sure why this is happening, but it is something that they've been using for a couple of months now. And both the email and the lure content, subject line, all that were spoofing NATO. Ironically, right before, or not ironically, intentionally, right before the NATO summit was held, right wherever DC is, I guess behind me, right. Email had an HTML attachment that had if you open it, had a spoofed Outlook landing page that you can see there. And if the target clicks the fake link on the landing page, they are displayed a secondary HTML window, sort of mimicking another browser popping up with this sort of browse in the browser style malware to then enter their credentials. But the secondary malware is stored inside, or the secondary HTML is stored inside the first one, but it's obfuscated. So a quick show of hands. Who thinks the next stage was encrypted using AES? No one, good. Who thinks it was a custom Zor cipher? One person. Who thinks it was classic hex encoding? Well, to whoever said base 64, you're right. I don't know if there are any red teamers in the crowd that are cringing at just ATOB being present in the first file you send to a victim, but this sort of came full circle for us because what was inside that secondary HTML was another version of the jump hook cred harvest kit. And you can sort of see some of the pipe dream references there. We don't need to carve it out. You can sort of imagine what it looks like. And since we haven't seen much more browser in the browser, since then, we haven't seen more browser in the browser use, but we continue to see sort of the steady heartbeat of the jump hook web harvesting kits. And so this is our current view of their web harvest or their credential harvesting campaigns. And it's really interesting that a lot of these are sort of like one-off tries. Only the jump hook use has really taken hold and said, okay, we're going to stick with this and run with it. But it just goes to show how much this actor is willing to experiment. And even if they're using largely unimpressive means to achieve their goals of getting user or NCLM credentials. I actually want to take a bigger step back now and talk about when and where TA422 first uses its tools so we can gain some insights. And I couldn't decide on what to call this phenomena, so I'm going to take a couple stabs at it. Trickle-down cybernomics, Ukrainenomics, or just capability trickle-down. So unlike an economic policy, trickle-down actually does happen in cyberspace, particularly when it's across a shared org or even the same units. The top of the line you see there is a series of tools mapped to when they first got reported as used by mostly CERT UA, but some other partners that have, of course, been blogging that space. And at the bottom is those same tools when we saw them in our data targeting our customers. And the lag is pretty obvious, and it sort of shows like the they're getting priority use in Ukraine, not against their Western targets that are very obviously like second order to them right now. But what eludes us right now is the how. Or is this like, do the tooling and infrastructure teams get encouraged to like try things in Ukraine and then fail fast? And then if they don't work, they get kicked over to the West targeting teams? Do the operators and infrastructure people rotate so they get like a break from the front and instead can take like the cozier job of targeting like diplomats and government entities and Europe and the US. We're not entirely sure, but the trend is definitely there. And so as far as outlook, I think I'm going to get you guys to happy hour roughly 15 minutes early. So cheers to that. I think the main takeaways that I have from looking at these groups in particular over the last couple of years is the following. And that tooling is sort of obvious. We just talked about this. It'll get priority use where leadership deems it most necessary. And I think the second one, the principle of minimum effective effort, is actually really like the thing that I really want to touch on, because we have a really big gap in our expectations of the adversary and what the adversary's realities are. Just because something isn't leet doesn't mean we should ignore it, because looking down our noses at it isn't going to help us defend our customers any better. It's just going to make us overlook what this adversary is doing. And it's sort of like, okay, defending some of this stuff like hex encoded macros or HTML attachments isn't exactly the high end of stuff that we want to see. But if it's showing up at our customers, we still have an obligation to know what's happening and defend them from it. So, and I think the third and final point is that the GRU is well staffed and resourced enough to engage their targets on multiple fronts, if not in concert, at least in tandem. And we don't really have the luxury of just ignoring what's happening in Ukraine, because it might not happen to us, because there's a very high likelihood that tooling there will show up in tooling against us and our customers, if within weeks, if not months later. And on that slightly somber note, I can take any questions. Thank you so much for your time.